We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Now, you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you reach out to me through my email, oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our guest today, Trevor Aaronson. You can find him at TrevorAaronson.com. And if you go there, you could find all of his speaking engagements. We've had Trevor, this will be his third return back to the show. The first time was about his book, The Terror Factory, which is a great investigative reporting work that he's done about how the FBI kind of creates the terrorists and then arrests the terrorists, and then they get an increase on their budget, and then, it's all kind of, and usually like the terrorists that they catch is like barely coherent. Great book, Terror Factory by Trevor Aaronson. You can find all his writings over at the Intercept, theintercept.com, as well as he has a new Audible series. If you go to Audible Originals, he's got a podcast series there called Into the Madness. He'll be telling us about that, too. That sounds really incredibly fascinating. You can find him, of course, on Instagram, at Twitter. Mr. Trevor Aaronson, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me, Ed.
Hey, man, thank you so much for coming back on. I always love to have you here. Always got great content, man, great stories. But remind the audience, who is Trevor Aaronson?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist, and I report primarily on the intersection of national security and civil liberties. You know, a lot of my reporting relates to the FBI, but I try to take kind of a wide prism. And so, I don't write entirely about the FBI. And then also, as the FBI has become kind of more of a cultural center of America in the last 8 years, it's kind of widened this type of stuff I produce. But I write news articles for The Intercept, and I also produce documentary podcasts more recently. As you mentioned, Into the Madness is my most recent one.
Yeah, you got a great voice for audio for a podcast. So what is Into the Madness? What the hell is this about?
Yeah, so Into the Madness is a documentary series for Audible. I think it's my fourth or fifth Audible original series. And the genesis of this was actually related to the FBI. As you mentioned, my book, The Terror Factory, was about how the FBI would entrap people in, mostly Muslims, in sting operations, people that didn't have any connection to terrorists, didn't have any weapons of their own. And it would be an undercover agent or informant who would act as the terrorist and provide the weapons. And then when the arrest is made, it's announced with great fanfare by the government. And so what ended up happening was that, I'd been reporting on cases like this for a decade. Then January 6th happens, the Capitol riot. And one of the kind of conspiracy theories that comes out of right-wing media is that this was an inside job that the FBI had orchestrated January 6th. And Tucker Carlson, when he was on Fox News, gave this kind of conspiracy-laden monologue about how the FBI had orchestrated January 6th, and specifically mentions me in my work and my book as kind of pretextual evidence that the FBI does things like this. Yeah, and so this took off in right-wing media, and at the time I was getting a lot of requests from kind of far-right news outlets to say, like, tell us how January 6th was an inside job, right? Which obviously was not true. Mm. And I remember kind of really, and this is maybe an issue of our modern age, like, I really debated like how to handle this, right? Because my concern was that this is a conspiracy theory that should be debunked. Then the other side of it is like, if you publicly talk about this, are you giving this more oxygen and, spreading it further? And so I really wanted to find a way to talk about, the kind of spread of FBI conspiracy theories and kind of our conspiracy brain culture more broadly without doing something so entirely on the nose. And around that time in 2022, there was this mass shooting outside Chicago in this area called Highland Park, where this young man got on top of a rooftop, fired down at a 4th of July parade, and killed 7 innocent people. And what became clear was that he had created what's known as an alternate reality game prior to the shooting, and that he was trying to seed a conspiracy theory that the FBI was responsible for the shooting, that it was a false flag operation. And he had inspired a number of kind of so-called internet sleuths to follow him down this rabbit hole. And so I became really fascinated with what he was trying to do as it reflected kind of our larger conspiracy brain culture. And there was a young woman who became infatuated with him, started recording her calls with him in jail as he was awaiting trial, and was trying to prove that, there was something to this, claim of FBI involvement. And so the series kind of follows her obsession and follows how he tried to construct this conspiracy theory, as a way of showing how America has become more and more susceptible to these conspiracy theories, as a way of explaining the world and why that is so dangerous. And so, the series is a journalistic work. It's nonfiction. It's a documentary series told over 7 episodes. But I really structured it to kind of be an allegory about our larger kind of conspiracy brains world in America.
I got to confess, I have no time to listen to anything. I don't listen to anybody else. I'm so tempted to listen to this. I am so tempted to get addicted to Into the Madness by Trevor Aaronson. That sounds like. Now, are you trying to tell me that he came up with this plan to pin this on the FBI before the shooting?
That appears to be the case.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, he spent about a year putting together videos and online clues to kind of create this puzzle. Like an alternate reality game is like a puzzle that includes pieces that you distribute online, like videos or songs or websites, postings, whatever it might be. And then the idea is that it creates this puzzle that, your followers or people interested will use as clues to put together, an answer. And there are a number of very popular alternate reality games. But this was an example of, how he had kind of constructed this as a way of seeding a conspiracy theory, hoping that people would, do the work and help him propagate this idea that this was an FBI conspiracy theory, which I thought was fascinating as a way of kind of showing, how, as I mentioned, like how conspiracy brained America has become.
Go back and read Terror Factory, and you'll have an insight on the mind of Trevor Aaronson and how he comes up with this stuff. But let me ask you, I'm going to put on my Tucker Carlson hat for a second, right? So now, if the FBI and Nancy Pelosi, who's now just had her phone seized and all this kind of stuff like that, if they were behind January 6th, how is Ashley Babbitt a hero? And if all the guys there were Antifa in costumes and Trump costumes and FBI, why were they pardoned?
Right. Exactly. I mean, if you go back in time, like there were several different theories that, one, as you mentioned, was like Antifa did it, right? And then the other, I don't know if you remember there was like there was one congressman who was suggesting that the FBI was like bussing in rioters. I mean, the number of conspiracy theories that it came around January 6th were just like on their face, idiotic, but people seem to believe them. But you're right. If all of this was an inside job, why did these people need to be pardoned? I mean, certainly Trump as president now could declassify all of these FBI files that showed it was an inside job. Right. And so this was all, part of a political operation to try to kind of remove Trump's culpability for January 6th, right? To say that he had nothing to do with this, his supporters had nothing to do with this. And I think that's, that's partly what I try to get into it Into the Madness, which is that, this, conspiracy theories are no longer just this like, corner of the internet where Alex Jones is saying obscenely stupid things. These are now things that are driving our national, political, conversation and public policy. Including what we're going to talk about later, obviously the kind of Venezuelan gang issue. Like all of this kind of, has an overlap where, kind of we're living in this age of misinformation and disinformation, and it's very easy for conspiracy theories to spread. And kind of more, alarmingly, like how these conspiracy theories and false information, end up being the fuel for public policy that affects people's lives. Yeah,
Ed, we are in a terrifying situation when it comes to information and absorbing it and misinformation. And now we are throwing AI and fake videos and stuff. God only knows what's around the corner. But I did invite Trevor Aaronson here to talk about his article in the Intercept called How a Landlord and a Florida PR Firm Helped Trump Kick Off the Tren de Aragua gang panic. This is the Venezuelan gang in Aurora, Colorado. Now, we can say with an absolute certain fact, they were not eating dogs and cats in Colorado, right?
They were not that I'm aware of.
Okay, what was going on there in Aurora, Colorado?
In Aurora, Colorado, in 2022, as you may recall, there was a lot of border crossings, and this was an issue that ultimately Trump became a tenet of Trump's campaign, that there was a lot of border crossings. There were also a number of Venezuelans who came over in 2022 under what's called TPS, temporary protective status, given the unrest and persecution that potentially Venezuelans faced by the Venezuelan government. So a number of Venezuelans came and crossed the border. At the time, Governor Greg Abbott, as well as our governor, Ron DeSantis, we're trying to weaponize the immigration issue by sending immigrants to other states, primarily blue states. And in this case, Greg Abbott had bussed hundreds of Venezuelans from Texas who had crossed the border to Colorado. Oh. And so at that point, a number of nonprofit groups in the Denver area, specifically a suburb of Denver called Aurora, were working with these immigrants to put them in housing. And of course, the funding that's available for these efforts is limited. And so as a result, many of these Venezuelan immigrants in Colorado were ultimately provided apartments in buildings that weren't the best. And there was a couple of buildings that had a landlord known as CBZ Management that for years had been, receiving complaints about all sorts of problems, mice infestations, no working water, no working heat. And this had gone back years. And so a number of Venezuelan immigrants in Aurora took up apartments in these buildings. And it was around that time, as the landlord was facing civil and possible criminal penalties for the conditions of his apartments, that he came up with this story that, look, I can't make these repairs because my buildings have been taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and hired a PR firm based in Florida here called Red Banyan that then promoted that story or pitched it to the media. And so initially in the summer of 2024, there were stories in the local media and in the New York Post about how Venezuelans had taken over these apartment buildings. And that wasn't true. Local officials in Aurora had plainly said, we're not saying there aren't Venezuelan gang members, but the idea that these buildings had been taken over just is an exaggeration, and any crimes are quite isolated. And around that time, there was a Ring doorbell camera of men in one of these apartment buildings holding guns. And then that went on X. It was distributed by Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and it was shown out of context to be like, look, this building is overrun by armed gang members. And Donald Trump started saying, look, these are, the city of Aurora has been taken over by this Venezuelan gang, which is known as Tren de Aragua. And that, if he was elected president, he would go in and clean all this up. And he said he would do what's called Operation Aurora and get rid of all these gang members. And what's significant, obviously, is that Donald Trump was elected president. And in February, just a couple of weeks after he took office for the second time, he sends in ICE, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and Homeland Security in 8 different operations in the Denver area. And they go in and they tout that they're targeting 100 members of this Venezuelan gang. And of course, after all these eight operations are complete, they then announce we just found one gang member. And so at the same time, the Trump administration is now using this 200-year-old law to say we can deport anyone without due process because we've labeled them a member of this Venezuelan gang, which we are also now considering a terrorist organization. And so they've done a really they've done a really kind of capable job in the media of spreading this idea that there are lots and lots of these terrible gang members. They are, quote unquote, invading the country, as the Trump administration says, in order to justify the use of this draconian law to deport people without due process. But the truth is, if you look at how this kind of all of this started, this isn't an invasion. This is just a moral panic, right? And all of it starts from this strange story of this landlord trying to avoid penalties, hiring this PR firm to say, look, we can't do anything because Venezuelan gangs have taken over our apartment buildings. And so that's the story I tell, because I think it's an important one, because I think too often the media ends up failing in accurately describing what's happening when a moral panic is ongoing, right? I think the way the media is often structured is they're structured to talk about individual crimes and then, go to government officials, and those government officials say, yes, this is part of a larger pattern, but then really never go back and say, okay, like how much of a larger pattern is this and where did this story start? And so what I thought was great about this story in particular is that you could really just dissect and show that like this isn't really a true invasion. This is just a narrative that's been latched onto for political purposes.
Yeah, and if you go to theintercept.com and you look up Trevor Aaronson, and Aaronson has 2 A's at the beginning, how a landlord and a Florida PR firm helped Trump kick off the Tren de Aragua gang panic, you'll see they sent 400 freaking agents down there to do this operation.
Right, and they found just one suspected gang member, right? And I know that's an anecdote, obviously, but but anecdotally, that's pretty strong evidence that whatever invasion they're claiming exists can't be all that bad if 400 agents find just one member of this gang, and yet they are using this claim to expand presidential power and take away what I think most Americans would consider fundamental rights, even if you are not a U.S. citizen. If the government accuses you of something, in this case being a gang member, you should have due process rights to challenge that if it's untrue. And what's happening is that the government is using this claim of a Venezuelan invasion to justify these powers from a 200-year-old law that essentially suspend due process rights for these people who can now be removed, in some cases, to a horrible prison in El Salvador without being given the opportunity to challenge the government's claims. And and I think that creates a very dangerous slippery slope.
Yeah, and by the way, if you go back to this period of time when this was hot in the news and how allegedly the Hells Angels were on their way over there, I can independently corroborate what Trevor Aaronson is talking about now. And we didn't discuss this at all before. There's no, you've never met me before, Mr. Aaronson, right? we've never discussed this issue before. But when this came up in the news, I contacted the local tenants' rights leftist guys, and I said, hey, what's going on over there at this complex? What's going on? And they says, yeah, it's really not that much crime there. In fact, there's a lady who sells tamales from her window. She has like a little store on the first floor. She's a little old lady. And it's not that bad. It's not that bad. The building is a wreck. But give us a little background on the timeline. Now, this happened after they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets in Springfield, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, what the Trump campaign was really focused on was ginning up support and votes through a very xenophobic campaign against immigrants, right? And so, and also, that was a conspiracy theory too, right? There was someone on Facebook in Springfield, Ohio, who blamed their missing cat on a Haitian neighbor, and without evidence. And that Facebook post eventually blows up into this crazy conspiracy theory that Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, are eating cats and dogs, and something that, notoriously Donald Trump mentions in one of his debates, or his only debate with Kamala Harris. And none of that is true. Right? But it has, for the Trump campaign, it's I think, they would agree that it was politically potent, and that's why they used it to portray, these immigrants eating cats and dogs. However ridiculous that sounds, certainly they would get some people likely to believe it, I guess, as part of this larger xenophobic campaign. And I think what happened in Aurora was similar. In that, you have this incident where this apartment building, this landlord is trying to evade consequences from the conditions of his building, and then hires this PR firm to kind of pitch to the media a story about how it's been taken over by Venezuelan gangs, which was itself an exaggeration of what was really happening. That gets reported. And I think, at some point, someone from the Trump campaign seized on that and said, that's a narrative we can go with. And then they end up blowing it up, with the help of Elon Musk spreading the viral video that a lot of people saw. And, ultimately this becomes this larger story about how Aurora has been taken over by Venezuelan gangs, even though the city's police chief and the city's mayor denied that was happening. And I think what's really particularly egregious about this current situation is that, yes, it was disgusting that the Trump campaign promoted this lie that Haitians were eating cats and dogs. And yes, it was disgusting that the Trump campaign promoted this exaggeration in Aurora that Venezuelan gangs had taken over apartment buildings. But like, it had this false information is now fueling policy, right? Like, we are deporting people without due process because the president says and issued an executive order saying that evidence irrefutably supports that we are being invaded by a Venezuelan gang. And that just isn't true, right? Like, I don't know, yes, there are gang members, but if you're going to send 400 federal agents into the Denver area, which is supposedly the hotbed of this Venezuelan gang activity, and they find only one suspected gang member, like, that certainly does not suggest any sort of invasion. And I think, and the reason I think the reason I wanted to write this story is I don't think the media has done a particularly good job at pushing back and showing how this moral panic began and how these claims of invasion just are not supported by the facts.
Yeah, how do we get to a point where during a presidential debate, one of the candidates can look into the camera and start talking about them eating dogs and cats, and we don't blink an eye? What the hell happened to us, man?
I know. I mean, I think, I think we're living increasingly in a world, where people, the things that the whole society accepts as fact are very limited now, right? Mm. And I think, certainly when you have someone like Elon Musk promoting all sorts of misinformation on, an increasingly or a very influential social media platform, I think that those kinds of activities really shatter, this idea that we have a shared set of facts, and I think that allows situations like this, right? I mean, the other thing is that there's an entire ecosystem of right-wing media that is just going to create stories that back up whatever the White House is putting out, and so however absurd their claims, whether it's eating cats or dogs, or whether it's that Aurora has been taken over by Venezuelan gangs, there is a media ecosystem that is going to back that up. And people who are living in that media bubble, may end up living in a reality where they think that's true, even though it clearly is not.
And even the average social media user will, even after it's just become so ridiculous, just to own the libs, they got to own the libs. They'll just continue any lie, no matter how ridiculous. Eating the dogs, eating the cats. Let me ask you this about Aurora, Colorado. There was a video of these guys with the rifles, man, going there, supposedly door to door collecting rent. That was the story. What is the real story behind that video?
Yeah, so there was a video of them breaking into one of the apartments. Yeah. As far as I know, it's unclear exactly what was happening. Although it is clear that they had guns, they were kind of forcibly entering one of the apartments. The story of them collecting rent and forcibly, getting rent from people, from what I understand, was part of the false story. That wasn't actually happening. But it is clear that there were gang members there and there were guns, and which is no one has ever denied. There were isolated incidents of crime. It just so happened that became something that was captured on video. What the mayor and the police chief has said is that the crime in that area was quite isolated. But because you have this video of brown-skinned people carrying rifles, entering apartments, that by itself, was a powerful image, was a powerful video, and I think that without any context, allowed this story to kind of really get hysterical. That isn't to say maybe Aurora could have done more to curb gang violence. Like, no one is condoning any sort of like gang activity in any of these apartments, but it's a wholly different thing to have some sort of gang activity that local police should deal with than it is to have what the Trump administration describes as an invasion that justifies an expansion of federal powers.
Oh, yeah. Every day across America, we have drug, home invasions, the debt collection, all kind of stuff goes on every day by every race and every nationality. I would suspect maybe the Venezuelans were the smallest group in the country to do this. And then while we even get at this, too, this whole idea of this gang taking over this apartment complex, even the Hells Angels put out a denial that all this was crazy and they had nothing to do with it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, everyone who went, there was a video that I linked to in the Intercept piece where like the local police chief like goes to the apartment building and is like outside talking and being like, there are no gangs here, and it's, but yeah, everyone who went to the apartment building, had the same story, that like the more hysterical claims of some sort of like invasion or takeover just were untrue. Yet, it shows kind of the power of propaganda within the media and the power of false narratives within a presidential campaign that really has, no guardrails for staying on the truth. And I think like that's part of the problem that we're living in now, where we have an administration that is willing to lie to the American people fairly blatantly to justify its policy goals. And there is a contingent of the media that is willing to say just about anything to back up these claims that are false and make them appear true to the public. And and I think that creates a very dangerous time. You can justify all sorts of terrible policies that harm people if you get people to believe false things. And I think that's kind of the slippery slope we're on right now.
Yeah, especially about scary people of different nationalities and languages and ethnicities. Ooh, scary.
Right. It fits this larger, more xenophobic policy that the Trump administration has been pushing. Right. Immigrants are bad. We need to deport all the immigrants. And, so instead of like showing the vast majority of immigrants, working honest jobs, trying to get ahead, trying to live the so-called American dream, you're isolating this like extreme minority of people committing crimes as if to paint all immigrants that way. And, that's the kind of dangerous area we're currently in.
Yeah, Trump was actually saying that the crime rate in Venezuela had dropped because they had sent us all their Venezuelan criminals. We have all their criminals, their jails are empty, so their crime rate dropped. Did you happen to see that video of Stephen Miller having that complete meltdown talking to the Venezuelan reporter?
No, I think I remember someone mentioning it to me, but I don't think I ever saw it.
I gotta send it to you, man. I could only play like the last 5 or 10 minutes because it went on for so long, and Stephen Miller just had a complete freaking meltdown because this right-wing reporter from Venezuela is going to Steve. But they're both on the same side. Stephen Miller and this guy would agree if they could communicate. They would agree on the same thing. But he's saying to him, the statistics you're getting, those are Maduro's statistics. Why are you accepting his statistics? And Stephen Miller's going on and on. Oh, no. I'm talking about the rapes, the murders, the mutilations. He got to the point where he was trying to present an image that we're stepping over dead bodies to get into Starbucks.
I mean, that's what they want, right? Yeah. They want us to believe that. Yeah. And if you look at, there are examples of, Tren de Aragua alleged members committing crimes. I mean, the most, infamous is the death of Laken Riley, which was committed by an alleged Venezuelan gang member. But, this isn't some situation where, we're stepping over bodies left and right as a result of Venezuelan gangs killing them. Most of the crimes these alleged gang members have committed have been fairly isolated in places like Miami and Chicago. This is not some kind of nationwide crisis.
Yeah, definitely there's gang crime, there's violent crime, there's crime by immigrants, there's crime by Americans, there's crime by very serious crime in this country. And I don't know what to do about that, okay? What about now, and you were talking about how they're sending these guys down to El Salvador. Have you been following the news lately where they sent down some kind of a hairstylist down there because they had the wrong tattoo?
Yeah, so a number of people have now alleged that they had nothing to do with Tren de Aragua. That one person who had a tattoo that the government claimed showed that he was a member was basically like, I'm a tattoo artist. I tattoo all sorts of things to my body as like a portfolio of my work. There was the person that you'd mentioned, and that's really the challenge of this current situation, that we have allowed a situation where the government can label anyone a Venezuelan gang member and just deport them without having to prove that claim, right? And I think, like, broadly speaking, I think most Americans would agree that if you are a member of this violent gang and you are trying to commit crimes in the United States, you should be deported, right? Yeah. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. That said, though, the problem is that they are rounding up all sorts of people claiming they're members of Tren de Aragua and then deporting them without any kind of due process. And if you go on ICE's X account now, you'll see all sorts of mugshots of people they've arrested, says Tren de Aragua member. And it's like, are they a member? And if you want to be generous to the government, you could say, okay, well, maybe a majority of those people are members of this gang and should be put through removal proceedings. But, a bedrock value of our nation is this idea of due process, right? Which is that okay, the government is going to accuse you of it. And even if the government is right most of the time it makes these accusations, it is so important that we don't allow someone to be imprisoned or deported or punished due to a false accusation, that we allow everyone to receive these due process rights so that we can save the minority of people who may be subjected to a false accusation, right? I think most Americans would agree that's like, we should be doing that. And what we're essentially doing now is saying, okay, we're not going to do that as long as we label you a Venezuelan gang member. And, that's incredibly dangerous, because what is to stop the U.S. government from labeling all sorts of people Venezuelan gang members? As long as they don't have to prove those accusations, it's like a free pass for them to deport just about any immigrant in the United States. And I don't think that's a power any federal government should have. I mean, this is not, in my opinion, something that's like some anti-Trump thing. We shouldn't allow Trump to have this power. I don't think this is a power any American president should have. I think, suspending due process writ large to immigrants is not, a policy that I think is healthy for the nation.
No, it's a constitution thing. You know what I mean? Due process. This is what our country's founded on.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's a tricky thing too, because obviously the Trump, under U.S. law, the president has enormous powers toward immigration, right? Like even the immigration courts, even though they're called courts, are not under the judicial branch, right? They're departments of the Department of Justice. And so, there is a bit of a kangaroo court aspect to immigration law that has always existed. But what we're seeing now is kind of an even further kind of, an even further abuse of these kinds of powers by saying, okay, we're not even going to go through our kangaroo court, immigration court. We're going to just deport them without due process. Constitution be damned. And I guess in some ways I'm a little bit disappointed there isn't more outrage, because I think, my argument, including writing about, and I should mention that the reason I'm interested in this subject is it's like an evolution of a lot of the stuff I've been covering for 15 years, which is that, in the post 9/11 era, there was a tendency for the U.S. government to call people terrorists, allege that they are members of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, without, having to substantiate that claim. And by and large, the U.S. government is the sole kind of arbiter of who can be called a terrorist. And so then the media would then call these people terrorists. And it really inflates the perception that there's tons and tons of terrorists in the United States, even though there wasn't. And similarly, here we have the U.S. government being the sole arbiter of who is or who is not a member of this Venezuelan gang, saying there are all these arrests of Venezuelan gang members. That then gets repeated in the media, including more responsible media like the New York Times, and then exaggerates the perception that there are all these gang members, which then, just as the exaggeration of the number of terrorists in the United States justified the expansion of federal powers and law enforcement powers, they're using the same tactic now with Venezuelan gang members to justify the expansion of these federal powers.
Oh, yeah, they're actually talking about people who vandalize Teslas, that put bubble gum on a Tesla should be the domestic terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like, in the immediate days after 9/11, when we were debating the Patriot Act, a number of civil libertarians had argued that this is fine, but this really creates a situation where down the line we're going to regret a lot of these laws that end up getting used against other people as we broaden the definition of who is a terrorist, right? And I think, this is the age we're living in now that those people warned us about, that we're seeing the application of anti-terrorism laws against people who, were not supposed to be the targets of those laws when those laws were originally written. And so now we're seeing the conflation of a Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, as a terrorist organization, since they've recently been designated as such. And, I think, we're now seeing, what you're describing, like they're describing, vandalism against Tesla dealerships. And I don't support that obviously, like, no one supports, criminal vandalism, but that is not an act of terrorism, right? But they are kind of defining it that way for, broadly political reasons.
Yeah, and could they be sent to El Salvador?
I guess, the alarmists would say that, right? Yeah. That the slippery slope we're on is that, yes, they're now kind of labeling these immigrants who have less rights than a U.S. citizen as members of this, quote unquote terrorist Venezuelan gang, and they can be deported to an El Salvadoran prison. But, does that mean down the line that they could say that about you or me? And, I don't know the answer to that, although I think, while it is a bit alarmist, I think the people making that argument are not making it because there's no reason to. I mean, I think it's certainly kind of if we take this to the worst logical place, like, that's where it goes. And I think
I'm making that argument because I'm alarmed. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And we can look back in history, and thanks to people like Trevor Aaronson, who wrote The Terror Factory, that all these guys, these right wing guys in their cowboy hats, that back at the time wanted to send every Muslim to Gitmo. Then later on, those same laws were used against them when they took over Bundy Ranch, when they went up there to Burns, up there in Burns, Oregon, up there, took over that ranch, and it's used against the white guys.
Right. Yeah. I think that's. This is kind of the larger theme of my work over the last decade and a half or so. Is that one of the things I've argued is that this was a key theme of the Terror Factory, which is like, yes, they're going after Muslims now, but you should not assume that it ends here, right? It's not like they're just going after Muslims. It's that, like, they're going after Muslims now because they're the most vulnerable population. They can get away with these kinds of abuses. And once they get away with these kinds of abuses, they will move on to other people. And we've already seen that, right? Like, and I think, that is kind of the short-sightedness of a lot of the terrorism laws and terrorism prosecutions we've seen enacted in the post 9/11 era, that we've expanded federal powers in dangerous ways. And now we have a president who is willing to use those powers in ways that are even more dangerous than his predecessor was willing to.
Yeah, and we really should thank Trevor Aaronson, TrevorAaronson.com, and his book, The Terror Factory, for shedding light on this. It's not easy to go up against the FBI and start making, exposés on the FBI. There's consequences to that. Since the first time we've discussed, I've asked you this question probably every time I've had you on the air. Have you experienced any consequences from this?
So I did. There was an incident last year under the Biden administration. I had been communicating with a young man in Michigan who was facing terrorism charges in federal court there, and we'd been communicating by phone for months. And I've been recording my calls with him, and obviously since he's in prison, the prison is recording those calls too. And the Justice Department started listening to those calls, and became very alarmed that he was sharing with me information about his case. And the Justice Department wrote this long brief, 20-some pages that was almost explicitly about me and him, and they accused me of, like, having what they called improper motives, and that I was looking to taint the jury pool, and that because I was talking to him for a documentary podcast, that a documentary is somehow different than a news article as far as journalism, and that it had lower standards and I should not receive the protections of a journalist. And so as a result, the Intercept and I retained counsel, and we sent a lawyer into the courtroom who then provided a letter kind of pushing back on these claims. And so far, nothing has happened since then. But it's incredibly alarming to, be singled out by Justice Department lawyers in something like that, because it certainly suggests that maybe more is coming. It certainly suggests that I could be under investigation. And to be clear, this was under the Biden Justice Department, right? And so I think it's a time for journalists to be, like, incredibly vigilant. I don't think our profession in recent history has been under greater threat, both economically and politically. But at the same time, I think that's all the more reason for journalists to try to not be cowed, because I think that's what they want.
Oh, exactly, man. And thank God you have the Intercept to back you up there a bit, because otherwise that stuff is terrifying. The federal government has a 97% conviction rate, and when they target anybody, I was just talking to somebody recently, Barrett Brown. And we were talking to Barrett Brown, and I was saying to him, I said, yeah, the feds, they'll go after your mother. They'll find dirt on your mother and use that against you when they're trying to convict you. And he goes, they went after my mother, Ed. And he's over in England right now hiding out with his...
Wow,
yeah. I know, man.
Yeah. No, and it's important to remember, too, like, even if you are not convicted,
right.
It's a life-altering situation, right? Like, your employment prospects are going to dim considerably if you're under federal indictment. The amount of money that you're going to have to spend, going up against the Justice Department that has an unlimited amount of money to defend your case, it is like it's a financially ruinous situation. And so even if you are ultimately found not guilty, being targeted by the government can be life altering. And I think that's always important to remember. But I also think that said, like, that's why it's all the more important for journalists to expose what's happening, because I think the more the public is aware, even at a time of fractured audiences and misinformation and disinformation, like understanding what our government is doing and bringing that to light, hopefully will prevent or limit abuses in the future. And, I think that's, the whole purpose of the Fourth Estate, really.
Okay, but be honest with me, man. Do you have it in you to back down? Like even if, we're looking at cattle cars, man, okay, which is it? We got the prisons in El Salvador right now in our faces. Okay, do you have it in you to back down?
I don't know. I have a wife and a daughter. It's like, I think it's a calculus that every journalist is making. But I don't want to be the journalist who backs down, and I haven't yet.
And you haven't yet.
Yeah. But that is not to say never, but it's just like I think journalists are facing a tough time right now.
Yeah.
But I also think for anyone listening, I mean, there are a number of great organizations, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and a few others that like there are a number of press advocacy groups that like this is their time, right? And so like if anyone deserves like your financial support, I would look up groups like them, because I think journalists like me are really turning to these larger groups that are staffed by lawyers who provide some measure of protection for us if things go sideways.
Let me ask you this. Back to this Intercept story about this apartment building over there by Trevor Aaronson, how a landlord and a Florida PR firm helped Trump kick off the Tren de Aragua gang panic. Now, we know that this landlord and this property owner had previous complaints, exactly, and I'm not blaming it on Venezuelans or anything like that, but as far as no water and no heat and holes in the roof and rats, he's got that going on as his pattern of operation. But what about this PR firm? What do we know about them? Are they doing these kind of operations with other cases?
So I wish I knew more about that. I mean, a lot of PR firms, they work. PR firms generally work in the background, so it's sometimes unclear what kind of clients they take on. So there's a limited amount of information available on Red Banyan, other than they have offices here in Florida as well as in Colorado and I believe California, although I could be wrong on that one. But it's I don't one of my initial thoughts was like sometimes PR firms are aligned with political movements. Is this a kind of MAGA aligned PR firm? And I couldn't find that either way. So it for all I know, this is a very kind of above board PR firm that was hired by a client to do a job, and that's the job they did by kind of pitching to the media the presence of these Venezuelan gangs. I don't know that the PR firm is necessarily directly responsible for the creation of this narrative. All we know is that they were the ones that were initially pitching it to local media as a story, and then those initial stories are kind of what seeded this kind of larger false narrative.
And it is, especially in the Hollywood scandal type of stories I've been dealing with my whole life, the power that these PR firms and the kind of people they've hired, they got all kind of sources, and they can just flip a switch and shut a story down in one day. I've seen it so many times. And they've got these characters, these fixers and stuff like that I've had on the show. Okay, some of my friends of mine. It's just imagine the power in that whole world. But let me ask you this. Now, the plan here is here you got all these guys who evacuated, refugees from Venezuela, right? So they're counter-revolution. They're against the revolution in Venezuela. And now we're going to send them back. What kind of, and we're trying to overthrow Venezuela all over the joint, right? Well, what kind of message does this send in foreign policy to the people in Venezuela we're trying to inspire to overthrow their socialist government?
Right. I mean, there's an incoherence to it, right?
Yeah.
And this certainly wouldn't be the only
Cuba
incoherent
too, they're
policy.
doing it, by the way.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the Trump administration narratively is trying to get around that by saying, like, look, Maduro intentionally sent these gang members to us to destabilize the United States, which is a ridiculous allegation, but is the one that they've made public. And obviously that's not true. I mean, we can't say explicitly how every Venezuelan immigrant, like what motivated them to come to the United States. But, I think it's safe to assume broadly that these people are fleeing for economic and political reasons that are intertwined, right? Like the collapse and the mismanagement of and the corruption of Venezuela's government has caused a collapse of its economy, even though its oil wealth is quite considerable and it should probably be the wealthiest nation in Latin America. And so they're coming here looking for, some sort of safety, which is how they received what's called temporary protective status under the Biden administration. But I think politically it's very convenient to demonize them. And so they're sending them back to the United States, to Venezuela. But you're right. I don't know what this certainly means for, any sort of uprising when there's, you're clearly sending a message that, if you're leaving Venezuela for fears of political prosecution, the United States will send you back. And, it's like, it's a terrible message. But I think our current government is such an isolationist government right now that I don't know that they're necessarily thinking the longer game in these kinds of foreign policy issues.
Or they do seem to be chumming up to El Salvador.
Right, yeah. Which I mean, the current president of El Salvador, this prison that we are now contracting them to house our prisoners in, was created specifically as part of this, extrajudicial gang roundup that he's been doing, that has been broadly criticized by the international community, right? Yeah. And so there was a time when the United States would never do business with someone who is acting in that way. But, now we have the Trump administration and we're now friendly with those kinds of governments.
Yeah, just think back to the days of Jimmy Carter, even when he was in office and was concerned about international human rights. And to where we are today. But I have to say this. I will disagree with Trevor Aaronson publicly, okay? I believe that many of the economic hardships in Venezuela are due to the economic sanctions and sabotage and failed coup attempts by Trump's private security and Rudy Giuliani's clients, okay, that took place just recently, that was put down by angry fishermen, especially when you consider the fact that they expel U.S. diplomats and say they were trying to take down the power grid. And they expel all our guys, and a month later the power grid goes down. So clearly they had some information there. So I would defend the socialist policies of.
I was going to say, another. If you excuse my typing right now.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
I was going to say there's a great documentary that just came out that I saw a couple of months ago about the Venezuelan coup attempt during the first. What is the name of it here? It was produced by the guy who in South Florida who did like Cocaine Cowboys. Here it is. Men of War.
Okay.
Anyway, it's a really brilliantly done documentary that has access to this Canadian guy who joined the U.S. military and tried to enact this coup. And it just shows, they make a very compelling case of the first Trump administration's, involvement in it. And then when it went sideways, how they just kind of pretended like they had nothing to do with these guys.
I bet you're talking about the president of Silvercore.
I think that might have been the
mercenary company. He's on charges now in Tampa for weapons smuggling over that Venezuelan coup, and he just came out with a statement saying, "Hey, I had the authorization of the executive branch."
Right. Yeah. His name is Jordan Goudreau.
Yeah, that's the guy, man. That's the guy. Silvercore.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating story, and I mean, I guess it's fascinating in two ways. Like, it's fascinating for showing that the Trump administration really was trying this, and also that it did seem that they were kind of getting scammed by the opposition leader.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole thing from beginning to end. The people behind the coup were clients of Rudy Giuliani. They were money laundering and coke smuggling clients of Rudy Giuliani. Silvercore, that head guy, that Goudreau, he met the Trump guy. He was doing Trump's private security at his rallies with his mercenaries.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And he met Trump through Keith Schiller. who's been with Trump since New York days. But I did a job for Keith Schiller.
Did you really?
Keith Schiller was my client at one point. Keith Schiller was jealous of my little PI company in New York. And then the whole coup gets put down by angry fishermen.
Right.
Oh, I had Lev Parnas on the show, too. Lev Parnas knows the whole backstory behind that coup. He hasn't explained it to me yet, and he's a little gun-shy. You know who Lev Parnas is, right?
Sure, yeah.
Ukraine, yeah. Oh, are you friends with these guys, Men of War, the documentary? I'd love to get them on the show.
So I am not, but I would recommend, you could definitely find them. I would recommend looking at, I think the producer is Billy Corbin, the Miami filmmaker. He was not the director of this one. But I would reach out to his company. I imagine, they would be happy to chat with you.
That Venezuelan coup is so underreported, man. I'm proud of my own work that I did on it. Just maybe my ranting and raving in the middle of the night it wasn't the best, but the story is just so fascinating. Let's see. What else is going on with this Venezuela? Let me go through my notes here. I think I've got covered just about every little thing. Oh, yeah, wait. You said Rick Scott was the guy who forwarded these Venezuelans to Aurora. You think it's possible that this was pre-planned, the whole thing, way back, that this was orchestrated that far back, that it was the plan to put these Venezuelans there?
Oh, yeah. Well, just to clarify, not Rick Scott, Greg Abbott.
Greg Abbott, sorry.
Texas governor. Yeah. I mean, I have no reason to think that. I mean, I suspect this was just more serendipitous for the Trump campaign and the larger MAGA movement than anything else. I think, obviously, Greg Abbott was looking to make a political show of, busing these immigrants to places like New York and Colorado. And it just so happened that Aurora caught the Venezuelan bus. And I think it was just a kind of a confluence of kind of perfect circumstances that then these immigrants get put in apartment buildings that are notoriously, whose conditions are notoriously bad. Yeah. And then that provides kind of a cover. So I suspect that was more likely the case. I think that's the Occam's razor explanation, but you never know. But I think it's more likely coincidental than anything.
Yeah, what sparks my suspicion, and you could tell I'm a suspicious guy. What do you call it? Is when DeSantis sent his bunch. He funded a bunch to go from Texas to up to the, I think it was Martha's Vineyard or something like that. Up in up northeast, and he was this Florida airline company, private airstrip and private that was in Florida. They made a stop in Florida. I think they paid these guys like $800,000 to ship 100 people, and then it turns out later on that little Florida airstrip with these private had gotten like all these PPP loans, for these employees that they never had. and they made a stop there. There's no record of who was on the plane, who's got off the plane. What's going on? Who knows?
Right. Yeah.
What else can you tell us about this prison down in El Salvador? Because before they made this deal to stick people down here in that hell, you just imagine there's no beds in that jail. Everyone's just taking turns, But Matt Gaetz went down there to El Salvador, to the mansion, to the palace, and Don Jr. was down there, and it seems like they were planning this for quite a while.
Yeah, I think I think it seems fairly clear that the Trump administration is trying to create a show of deportations as much as possible in order to encourage, what they term self-deportation, just to have people leave. And my sense is that this is part of a larger strategy to get people to leave the country for fear that something awful will happen to them. And it's hard to imagine something more awful happening to you than being thrown in this horrific prison in El Salvador. And I suspect that's the big show of this. And that's why you've had people like Kristi Noem, going down there and doing their photo ops and looking tough as these gang member looking guys behind them are kind of, shown to the camera. Yeah. And I think it's gross and despicable, but at the same time, I think it's probably fairly effective for what they're desiring to do, which is to just create the prospect of horror for people who might be in this country illegally. Because, there's no way that the Trump administration can meet its goals of deporting the millions of people it says it wants to deport with, the current manpower of the federal government, which is being, sliced and diced every day by Elon Musk and Doge, right? So how do you then, reach these numbers? And I think this is part of that larger strategy, just to, make the cruelty transparent and clear, and so that you'll choose to leave. And anecdotally, there are a number of reports of immigrants choosing to leave, and so I think I think it has been effective in that way.
Oh yeah, just go to a construction site. Go to a construction site. All the framers are gone. 1 million out of these 10 million people they want to deport. 1 million are homeowners. Okay, out of these 10 million they want to deport, 1 million are business owners that employ other people. Who knows how many are self-employed? But they employ other. We're making unemployment. And we only got a couple of seconds. I don't want to take up all the time. But this Kristi Noem picks down there, an argument could be made if they're calling these people domestic terrorists. That's a war crime to photograph prisoners of war in that kind of manner and show the despicable conditions they're being held in. And that's an argument could be made of that.
I can see it. Yeah. I mean, I thought I remember just looking at those photos and just being horrified that this was our government, right?
Yeah,
right. Parading our high level officials in front of those conditions when those are conditions that from an international standpoint we should be condoning. But that's, obviously not where we are as a nation right now. And my hope is that, we can come back on the other side, but I don't know. It just seems that we are shifting, into a different kind of America.
Well, there is a pendulum. The pendulum does swing back and forth. There was a time Nazi Germany was full of Nazis. Italy was fascist.
Sure,
and they turned around a little bit, right? So let's hope
transformation.
We swing all the way back. We've been talking to Trevor Aaronson. Mr. Aaronson, you have an open invitation anytime you want to come back. You just give me a call. I'll put you right back on the air. He's a writer for the Intercept. Check out his Audible original, Into the Madness. You hear the way this guy tells a story. It's got to be a great podcast there. And also, of course, the Terror Factory. In 1 minute, what can you leave us there with, Mr. Aaronson?
Oh man, I guess just be skeptical, right? There's a lot of false information out more than ever, and it's really important just to if you're hearing something, do your best to verify if it's true, because there's a good chance it's not.
Yeah. Trevor Aaronson, once again, it's TrevorAaronson.com. Check him out at The Intercept, and also Instagram and Twitter at Trevor Aaronson. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Good night.